Twice that month the ice groaned around the ship, nipping her sides and causing the Endurance to vibrate slightly. It was the first palpable hint of the pack's deadly potential. On the last day of the month, the ship company were entertained by a rare spectacle. Shackleton and Worsley took a break from inspecting Lee's motor sledge and, inspired by some private whimsy, danced together in a stately waltz on the ice, while a member of the crew whistled the Policeman's Holiday. Lee's record of this improbable event was perceptive. "That is Sir Ernest all over," he wrote of the famous polar explorer's courtly gyrations. "He is always able to keep his troubles under and show a bold front. His unfailing cheeriness means a lot to a band of disappointed explorers like ourselves. In spite of his own great disappointment, and we all know that is disastrous enough, he never appears to be anything but the acme of good humour and hopefulness. He is one of the greatest optimists living. He enters the lists every time with the spirit that every prize fighter enters the ring with." In June began the darkest part of the year. Save for the moon and a couple of hours of dim twilight at noon, there was no light. The temperature had dropped to the -20s, and leads of water that had been clear only the day before became encrusted with 6 inches of ice overnight. During this darkening period of dead calm, on June 9th, heavy pressure broke. Some 500 yards from the ship, colossal plates of ice screamed and groaned against each other, exploding now and then with the muffled boom of distant artillery. Guided by hand lanterns, several men went out to observe the pressure as it piled huge blocks of ice, each many tons in weight, one atop the other to a height of 15 feet. The roaring continued through June 12th, but the weather thickened, making more excursions impossible. By June 15th, all was calm again, and a race between dog teams was planned for the following day. The rollicking dog derby was a much welcome diversion after the ominous bout of pressure. In the twilight, the track was lit with hurricane lamps, and Shackleton himself acted as starter. He had given all hands the day off, and several of the able seamen entered into the spirit of the day by appearing dressed as bookies, although, as Hurley remarked, as they look a trifle disreputable, their odds are not accepted. With a flutter of handkerchiefs and cheers of encouragement, the dogs were off. Wild's team won, having covered the 700 yards in 2 minutes and 16 seconds. Only days later, yet another holiday was festively observed. June 22nd, Midwinter's Day, was commemorated with a feast and after-dinner entertainment. Hurley erected a stage decorated with bunting and set up acetylene footlights. An overture, Discord Fantasia in 4 flats, was performed by the Billabong Band, while James offered the most successful sketch of the evening, appearing as Herr Professor von Schoppenbaum to give a dissertation on the calorie. "Very witty and truly unintelligible," Worsley wrote appreciatively. After midnight, the company sang God Save the King and wished one another well for the days ahead. From within the coziness of the Ritz, it is hard to imagine we are drifting frozen and solid in a sea of pack ice in the heart of the Weddell Sea, Hurley wrote. Yet, he added, I often wonder what is to become of it all. His words imply that certain possibilities were not discussed, even as the creaking, booming sounds of distant pressure were carried through the crisp air to the stricken ship. By the end of June, the Endurance had drifted more than 670 miles since her entrapment, and each mile brought her closer to the open water beyond the pack and to the prospect of freedom. The hours of daylight were now increasing appreciatively, and the men could look forward to seeing the sun again. Dog exercising became easier with the returning light, and concerts and lantern slide lectures continued as entertainment. After several days of clear calm, a strong gale arose on July 12th, and grew into a full-blown blizzard by July 13th. The ship quivered as the pressure ground around her. Wild and Worsley were visiting with Shackleton in his cabin. The wind howled in the rigging, Worsley recalled, and I couldn't help thinking that it was making just the sort of sound that you would expect a human being to utter if he were in fear of being murdered. In the lulls of the wind, the 3 men listened to the grinding of ice against the ship's sides. It was now that Shackleton shared what he had known for many months. The ship can't live in this, skipper, he said, pausing in his restless march up and down the small cabin. You'd better make up your mind that it is only a matter of time. It may be a few months, and it may be only a question of weeks or even days, but what the ice gets, the ice keeps. Worsley reports that he received this news with despair and incredulity, and it is difficult to tell whether, in the few remaining months ahead, he regarded the loss of his ship as truly inevitable. He was, in his way, a more incurable optimist than Shackleton. But Shackleton knew, and what Shackleton knew, Wild took on faith. The men left their meeting and went back to the old routine, betraying nothing. "It is bitterly cold, and no one is allowed away from the ship," Hurley wrote the following day. "We are not anxious, however, the alluring coziness of the Ritz being too enticing." On the opposite side of the Ritz, however, Macnish was writing in his diary from a very different perspective. "We had a slight shock last night, or this morning early," the old seaman wrote. "At least there was a noise under the bottom aft, the same as if the ice had broken up. I jumped on deck, but we could not find out what it was. The boss thinks it was a whale, but I think different." On July 21st, amid heavy pressure, Shackleton ordered the decks cleared in the event the dogs had to be evacuated from the breaking ice. Hourly watches were set throughout the night. The following day, Worsley rushed to the Ritz to announce that the ice had cracked some 30 yards ahead of them. All hands donned Burberrys and headgear and hurried outside. Some 300 yards off the port bow, colossal pressure was piling up massive blocks of ice, as if they were sugar cubes. The sledges were brought off the floe, and Shackleton, Wild, and Worsley each took a 4-hour watch during the night. Shackleton's daily sleep was now down to about 3 hours in the afternoon. Over the ensuing days, emergency rations were stored with the sledges, ready for use, and on August 1st, the dogs were hastily brought on board shortly before a wave of pressure caused blocks of ice to flatten the kennels and grind them to powder between the jaws of opening and closing floes. A large lump of ice that had become jammed under the rudder was manoeuvred away, but damage had already been done. As the gale raged, the Endurance was shaken like a toy by the pressure, knocked to her port side and nipped forward, backward, and side to side. Soundlessly she resisted, but when this onslaught ceased, a massive new pressure compressed her sides, causing her to strain and groan until her beams actually buckled. "Everyone got our warm clothes put up in as small a bundle as possible," wrote Macnish that night. "I have placed my loved ones' photos inside Bible we got presented with from Queen Alexandra, and put them in my bag." Around the ship, blocks of ice caught between moving floes jumped like cherry stones, squeezed between a gigantic thumb and finger. The wind blew hard all night, then dropped the following day when all became quiet, save for an occasional distant rumbling. Shackleton calculated that the gale had caused the ship to drift as much as 37 miles north in the 3 days it had raged. Throughout this ordeal, Lees, recovering from sciatica, had lain alone in Marston's bunk, to which he had been moved at his own request. From this deck cabin he had listened to the rumbling and upheaval of the ice, and the tramping of the watchman's feet overhead. While the ship rocked and trembled, he held his breath, waiting to see how she would settle. On August 9th, he ventured outside for the first time in 3 weeks, thinner and greatly weakened. Outside, an amazing sight awaited him. The Endurance lay in an entirely new landscape. All the old familiar landmarks were gone or dislocated, and the ship appeared to have been forced forward 100 yards through ice 6 feet thick. "How this little ship survived amidst such a mighty upheaval is almost inconceivable," he wrote. "As it is, she lies very much on her side, with her rudder cracked and surrounded by great piles of ice blocks rising as high as her decks. We used to step out onto a comparatively level floe. Now, on stepping outside, one finds oneself immediately in a labyrinth of ice blocks and gullies." Yet the Endurance had survived, and the pressure had vanished. Gradually the weather cleared, and as the winter drew to a close, the sun tentatively returned, shining for several hours each day. Spirits rose as old routines were resumed. The greatest amusement was provided by Crean, who was undertaking to train the puppies he had nursed so tenderly. On their first day in harness, his fat charges, now weighing some 70 pounds each, lay on their backs, waved their legs in the air and squealed. "Their howls and roars of terror resounded for miles around," wrote Worsley, one of the many bystanders entertained by the spectacle. "They pursue a devious and uncertain course. Though each pup possesses the voice of Jeremiah, his paunch is the paunch of Falstaff, and they flounder, puff, and pant along through the snow, until to their joy they are headed for the ship, and for a few minutes drag the hated sledge almost as fast as a dog team. Crean expects in 2 more lessons to teach them to drag a sledge unaided by an old leader. They will then be formally promoted from perps to dags." The rest of August passed without incident. Glorious sunrises tinted the ice pink, and delicate ice formations that formed on new leads of water resembled fields of carnations. On the night of August 27th, with the temperature at -24 degrees, Hurley set up 20 flashes behind hummocks of ice around the stricken Endurance. Half-blinded by the successive flashes, he recorded, "I lost my bearings amidst hummocks, bumped shins against projecting ice points, and stumbling into deep snowdrifts." But the image he secured was haunting. The rime-crusted Endurance, breasting the ice, a spectral ship, both gallant and vulnerable. Spring was on the way. The men began to speculate whether, on breaking out, they would immediately return to Vassal Bay and embark upon the transcontinental crossing, or would return to civilization first for provisions. Bets were placed on the breakout date. McElroy hazarded November 3rd. Lees, ever pessimistic, thought it unlikely to occur before mid-February. Shackleton said he believed it would be October 2nd. The pressure returned on the night of August 26th. For several days it presented no immediate danger, but in the early hours of September 2nd, it took hold of the Endurance with a vengeance. "On the night of 2nd of September, I had one of the most startling moments of my life," Bakewell recalled. "I was lying in my bunk when the ship literally jumped into the air and settled on its beam. The iron plates in the engine room buckled, door frames were distorted, beams bulged as if they would splinter. The Endurance struggled and groaned as if in mortal pain. There were times when we thought it was not possible the ship would stand it," wrote McNish. He had watched the 3-foot square iron plates bulge up 1.5 inches, but the pressure passed, and a week later McNish was busy building a wheelhouse that would protect the steersmen from the elements once they were underway again. Meanwhile, Shackleton had privately calculated that they were 250 miles away from the nearest known land, and more than 500 from the nearest outpost of civilization. September unfolded without further crises, although the roar of distant pressure was seldom absent, and the floes around the ship were in constant movement. The men played football on the shifting floes, exercised the dogs, and hunted for seals, which were returning with the promise of spring. A light snowfall one night left the ship shimmering as if tinselled, and the ice sparkling as though covered with diamonds. On the afternoon of September 20th, the most severe bout of pressure encountered so far shook the Endurance from mast to keel, so that it seemed her sides would have to collapse. But an hour later the pressure subsided. It was October 1915. On the 3rd day of the month, heavy pressure broke 10 yards from the ship. The Endurance was by now as frozen onto the blocks of ice beneath her, in Lee's words, as any rock in a glacier. During a brief opening of the ice around the ship, the men had gazed down into the open water by her side and seen, spotlit by the penetrating sun, great azure-blue conglomerates of ice lying as much as 40 feet below the surface. Frost smoke rose from out of the open leads, red-tinged at sunrise, so that the ice seemed at times to be aflame. High temperatures, up to 29 degrees, on the 10th produced a general mushy thaw. The men started packing up the Ritz, and on the 13th returned to their original quarters. The following night, the floe on which the Endurance was lodged suddenly split. The ice slithered out from under the ship, and she floated on an even keel, in clear water for the first time in 9 months. Impelled by the gale that had risen, she swung in the narrow lead, and actually drove 100 yards ahead. Then the ice closed on her, and she was fast again. Over the following days, while the pack was still loose, Shackleton had the sails set, and an effort was made to force the ship ahead, but with no success. Shortly after tea on the 16th, after several loud bumps against her sides, the Endurance began to rise above the ice, squeezed up between the floes, then abruptly thrown to her port side, listing some 30 degrees. Kennels, dogs, sledges, stores, all were thrown across the deck into a tangled, howling heap. Then around 9 in the evening, the pressure subsided, and the ship returned to an even keel. On the 19th, Shackleton had the boilers filled and fires banked in readiness, and ice debris was cleared from around the rudder and the ship. McNish was commissioned to build a small punt, with a view to navigating the leads and channels. Light snow fell on and off throughout the day, and in the evening a killer whale appeared in the tiny pool around the ship, his huge body seen plainly through the calm, clear water as he cruised leisurely up and down beside the stricken ship. In the following days the roar of pressure was continually in the men's ears, likened by James to the sound of London traffic when one is sitting quietly in a park. Sea watches were resumed, while the ice floes ground around the ship. The Endurance was now shaken and beaten constantly, but the men had become so accustomed to the disruptions that they were indifferent to all but the most violent upheavals. "Personally," wrote Worsley, "I've got tired of alarm against which we can do absolutely nothing. The dogs, restless from lack of exercise, howled and whimpered as the ominous sounds arose from the ice. "The ice is opening up a bit, thank goodness," Lees wrote on the 23rd. "Things look a little more hopeful." After a dinner of salt beef, carrots, mashed potatoes, and Banbury tarts, the traditional Saturday night toast was drunk to sweethearts and wives. There was now as much as 22 hours of daylight each day. On Sunday, October 24th, the men watched the pressure move across the ice throughout the otherwise uneventful day. In the evening, after dinner, Lees had just put The Wearing of the Green on the gramophone when a terrific crash shook the ship like an earthquake, causing her to shiver and list over about 8 degrees to starboard. The men finished listening to the tune, then went up on deck, according to Lees, to see if anything unusual had occurred. They found Shackleton on the ice with a grave face, examining the ship's sternpost. Caught between 3 separate pressure ridges across her bow and both sides, the Endurance had been twisted and bent by their onslaught. The sternpost had been almost wrenched out and was leaking dangerously. Immediately Shackleton gave the order to raise steam for the engine-room pumps. With water rising rapidly, the engineers, Rickinson and Kerr, desperately piled on fuel, coal, blubber, wood, racing to raise steam before the rising water could put the fires out. Within 2 hours they had the pump working, but they soon saw that it could not cope with the inrush of water. Hudson, Greenstreet, and Worsley disappeared into the bunkers where the coal was stored, to clear the bilge pump, which had been jammed with ice all winter. Digging through the coal in the darkness, now underneath icy black water, they succeeded by early morning in clearing the pump with a blowtorch, and it was worked in shifts throughout the night. On the floes, the men took turns, away from the pumps, to dig desperate, ineffectual trenches around their dying ship. Inside, the sound of running water and the clickety-clack of the pumps rose above the creaking of the ship's tortured timbers. Down in the engine-room, Chippy McNish was working with fierce concentration, building a cofferdam across the stern to contain the leak. Crouched in the water that rose at times to his waist, he toiled unremittingly through the night. Meanwhile, all other hands were feverishly gathering together stores, clothing, sledging gear, and dog food in preparation for disembarking onto the ice. Worsley went through the ship's library, tearing maps, charts, even photographs of possible landfalls out of the books they would have to leave behind. Marston, Lees, and James worked in the after hold, removing supplies, while the sound of rushing water resounded beneath them, and the ship's beams creaked and exploded like pistol shots overhead. On the following morning, Hurley visited McNish, who had laboured without rest on the cofferdam, and found that the leak had been checked. "The water is level with the engine-room floor, but it is being easily kept under," he wrote. "We still hope to bring our staunch little craft through." It was a cloudy, misty day. Pressure could be seen and heard all around, raising the ice to unimaginable heights, but the ship herself was quiet. McNish still toiled on in the engine-room, filling with concrete the space between the 2 bulkheads he had built and caulking them with strips of torn blankets. "Things look a bit more promising now," wrote Wordie later in the day. "The sun is shining, for one thing, and we are hoping the cofferdam is a success." From 4 in the afternoon until midnight the pumps were worked continuously, until the incoming water was under control. All stores were shifted from the stern so as to raise it above the water when the ice opened and allowed the ship to float again. Only the bilge pump was worked throughout the night, and the exhausted men snatched minutes of sleep despite the faint whispers of distress that arose from the ship. Chippy McNish was still below working on the cofferdam. The 26th dawned clear, save for gentle, fleecy clouds, and full of sunshine that glinted with sparkling beauty off the ice. With the roar of pressure in his ears, Shackleton was struck by the surreal incongruity between the serene beauty of the day and the death throes of his ship. From the bridge he had seen how the pressure was actually bending her like a bow, and it had seemed to Worsley that she was gasping to draw breath. She was leaking badly again, and the exhausted men worked the pumps in shifts, 15 minutes on, 15 minutes off, half asleep on their feet. At 9 in the evening, Shackleton ordered the lifeboats and sledges lowered to a stable flow. The leak slowed, staunched to some degree by movement of the ice. "All hope is not given up yet for saving the ship," wrote Hurley. Nevertheless, he took the precaution of packing his photo album in waterproof cloth, it being the only record of my work I shall be able to take, should we be compelled to take to the floe. The Endurance had quieted, but that evening an unsettling incident occurred while several sailors were on deck. A band of 8 emperor penguins solemnly approached, an unusually large number to be travelling together. Intently regarding the ship for some moments, they threw back their heads and emitted an eerie, soulful cry. I myself must confess that I have never, either before or since, heard them make any sound similar to the sinister wailing they moaned that day, wrote Worsley. I cannot explain the incident. It was as if the emperors had sung the ship's dirge. MacLeod, the most superstitious of the seamen, turned to Macklin and said, "Do you hear that? We'll none of us get back to our homes again." They continued to work the pumps throughout the night and morning. October 27th dawned, clear and bright, with a temperature of -8.5 degrees. The ice had not ceased to roar, but the men were now too tired to notice. The pumps were being worked faster and faster, and someone was actually singing a shanty to their beat. The pressure increased throughout the day, and at 4 p.m. reached its height. With a blow, the ship was knocked stern up, while a moving floe ripped away her rudder and sternpost. Then the floe relaxed, and the beaten Endurance sank a little in the water. The decks began to break upward, and as the keel was ripped out, the water poured in. It was all up. At 5 p.m. Shackleton gave the order to abandon ship. The dogs were evacuated down canvas chutes, and the supplies that had been readied were lowered to the ice. Shackleton, standing on the quivering deck, looked down the engine-room skylight to see the engines dropping sideways as the stays and plates gave way. "Everything has come too quickly to make us pause to regret," wrote Wordie. "That will come in the future." The men were numbed by fatigue and the suddenness with which the end had come. None of the diaries evinces much concern for personal safety. All emotion was expended on the death of the ship. From her first entrance into the pack, they had cheered her fighting spirit. Noble, gallant, brave, our stout little ship. These had been the proud words with which they had characterized her. It was her maiden journey. She was, in Hurley's words, a bride of the sea. "It is hard to write what I feel," wrote Shackleton. "To a sailor his ship is more than a floating home. Now, straining and groaning, her timbers cracking and her wounds gaping, she is slowly giving up her sentient life at the very outset of her career." Before departing for good, Hurley had taken one last look around their old quarters in the Ritz, already a foot deep in water. The sound of beams splintering in the darkness was alarming, and he abruptly left. But of all sights and sounds, it was the clock ticking comfortably in the cosy wardroom as the water rose that perhaps most unnerved him. Shackleton was the last to leave. He hoisted the blue ensign, and the men on the ice gave 3 hearty cheers. By a cruel accident, the ship's emergency light had switched on, and as its circuit was intermittently broken, the Endurance seemed to all hands to bid them a final, sad, flickering farewell. Patience Camp. For the crew of the Endurance, from Alexander, May 31st, 1914. May the Lord help you to do your duty, and guide you through all dangers by land and sea. May you see the works of the Lord and all his wonders in the deep. Inscription in Ship Bible, presented by Queen Alexandra. "Assemble on floe, boss explains situation and we turn in," wrote Wordie. They had set up camp on what appeared to be a stable floe, only some 100 yards from their shattered ship. As far as could be seen, in every direction around them, the ice rose in contorted, colossal fragments. The temperature had fallen to -15 degrees. They were 350 miles from the nearest land. Each man was issued a sleeping bag and assigned to one of 5 tents. "There was only 18 skin bags, and we cast lots for them," wrote McNish. "I was lucky for the first time in my life, for I drew one." By some piece of subterfuge that did not escape the sailors, most of the officers happened to draw the less desirable Jaeger wool bags. There was some crooked work in the drawing, able seaman Bakewell recorded, as Sir Ernest, Mr. Wilde, Captain Worsley, and some of the other officers all drew wool bags. The fine, warm fur bags all went to the men under them. Lying on ground sheets that were not waterproof, the men listened to the grinding and booming of the floes, like distant thunder, travelling through the ice directly under their heads. The sound now unmuffled by their ship's stout wooden walls. Their linen tents were so thin that the men could be seen through them. 3 times in the night, the floes on which they were camped cracked beneath them. 3 times they had to pick up tent, sleeping bag, and ground sheet, and pitch them all again. "A terrible night," wrote James, "with the ship sullen dark against the sky, and the noise of the pressure against her, seeming like the cries of a living creature." Shackleton himself did not return to his tent. but paced the ice, listening to the pressure and staring at the light in his ship. Like a lamp in a cottage window, it braved the night, he wrote, until, in the early morning, the Endurance received a particularly violent squeeze. There was a sound of rending beams, and the light disappeared. In the chill dawn, Shackleton was joined by Hurley and Wild in salvaging tins of petrol from the wreck. Erecting a makeshift galley, they prepared warm milk and took it to the men in their tents, surprised and a trifle chagrined, as Shackleton recorded dryly, at the matter-of-fact manner in which some of the men accepted this contribution to their comfort. They did not quite understand what work he had done for them in the early dawn, and I heard Wild say, "If any of you gentlemen would like your boots cleaned, just put them outside." After breakfast, Shackleton again summoned the men, and informed them that in a few days they would begin a march towards Snow Hill or Robertson Island, some 200 miles to the northwest. As always with him, what had happened, Macklin wrote. It was in the past, and he looked to the future. Without emotion, melodrama, or excitement, he said, "Ship and stores have gone, so now we'll go home." The planned march required the men to drag with them basic supplies as well as 2 of the 3 lifeboats. Every hand had been issued new winter gear and a pound of tobacco. Beyond this, each was limited to 2 pounds of personal possessions. A few exceptions were made. Shackleton allowed Hussey to take his banjo on the premise that it would supply the men with vital mental tonic. By way of example, before the assembled men, Shackleton discarded a handful of gold sovereigns and his gold watch on the ice, followed by his silver brushes and dressing cases. He then took the Bible that had been presented to the ship before departure by Queen Alexandra. Ripping out the flyleaf and a few other pages, he laid the Bible on the ice. The pages he retained were those of the 23rd Psalm, and these verses from Job. "Out of whose womb came the ice, and the hoary frost of heaven, who hath gendered it? The waters are hid as with a stone, and the face of the deep is frozen." A pile of discarded dress uniforms, scientific equipment, books, watches, cooking utensils, ropes, tools, flags, sextants, chronometers, diaries, and blankets grew as the men dumped all non-essential personal effects. McNish was busy fitting the boats to sledges, while others sorted rations, stored their gear, and sewed pockets on their clothing for precious possessions like spoons, knives, toilet paper, and toothbrushes. There were no disturbances over the next 2 nights, and on October 30th, the men awoke to a raw, snowy morning. Everything was ready for the start of the march, and at 1:15 p.m., a pioneering party consisting of Shackleton, Hudson, Hurley, and Wordie got under way. Shackleton shouted, "Now we start for Robertson Island, boys," and everyone cheered. The job of this advance guard was to attempt to break down the hummocks, ice blocks, and pressure ridges over which the boats and dog sledges would travel. At 2:55 p.m. Crean shot 3 of his puppies and Mrs. Chippy, who had come to be known as the ship's mascot. It was left to Macklin to put down his dog Sirius, who had never been broken to harness. Sirius, ever friendly, jumped up to lick Macklin's hand, which was shaking so much that he required 2 shots to finish the job. The sound of the shots, ringing out over the ice, cast a pall over an already gloomy day. At 3 p.m. the rest of the procession set out. From the pathfinding party at the head to the 15 man-hauling the large lifeboat in the rear, the unwieldy column stretched for as much as a mile. 7 dog teams relayed back and forth with smaller loads. At 6 p.m. the party halted for the night. They had travelled just under a mile. A wretched day, Lees wrote the following morning. Snowing hard, with a very high temperature and everything wet. Owing to the snow, they did not set out until the afternoon. After they had travelled only half a mile, the weather thickened, and Shackleton called a halt. On the 3rd day, November 1st, sinking at times to their hips in the wet snow, they covered a quarter of a mile before calling it quits. "The condition of the surface is atrocious," wrote Hurley. "There appears scarcely a square yard of smooth surface, which is covered by a labyrinth of hummocks and ridges." After a conference with his ad hoc advisory committee, consisting of Wild, Worsley, and Hurley, Shackleton acknowledged that further efforts were futile. He announced that they would pitch a new camp and await the breakup of the ice, which would allow them to take the boats into open water. His hope was that the drift of the pack would carry them northwest to within striking distance of Paulet Island, nearly 400 miles distant. Nordenskjöld's Swedish expedition had built a hut there in 1902, and Shackleton knew it to be stocked with emergency supplies. He himself had helped provision the relief operation for the expedition 12 years earlier. From here, a small overland party would continue west to Grahamland and make its way to Wilhelmina Bay, where they could expect to meet up with whaling vessels. Meanwhile, the new camp, established on a sturdy floe some 20 feet thick, only a mile and a half from the wreck of the Endurance, was christened Ocean Camp. Throughout the ensuing days, salvage teams ferried back and forth between Dump Camp, the site where the Endurance had been abandoned, and their new quarters. Many objects removed from the ship during the disaster had sunk into the snow and become embedded in the ice. Nonetheless, much was retrieved, including part of the Encyclopedia Britannica. The entire wheelhouse, now under 3 feet of water, was removed from the ship's deck and put to use as a storehouse. McNish hacked an opening through the deck above the old Ritz, disgorging various cases of food, some more useful than others. Containers of sugar and flour floated out to loud cheers, while the appearances of walnuts, onions, and soda carbonate were met with groans. It was during this time of precarious digging in the bowels of the wrecked ship that Hurley determined to rescue his negatives. During the day, he wrote, I hacked through the thick walls of the refrigerator to retrieve the negatives stored therein. They were located beneath 4 feet of mushy ice, and by stripping to the waist and diving under, I hauled them out. Fortunately, they are soldered up in double tin linings, so I am hopeful they may not have suffered by their submersion. As the new plan called for eventual recourse to the boats, the weight of personal possessions allowed to each man was strictly limited. But when Hurley returned with his precious negatives, Shackleton relented. I spend the day with Sir Ernest, selecting the finest of my negatives from the year's collection, Hurley wrote on November 9th. He resoldered 120 and dumped about 400. This unfortunate reduction is essential, as a drastic cutting down in weight must be effected, owing to the very limited space that will be at disposal in boat transport. The selected negatives included 20 Paget colour as well as 100 whole and half-glass plates. He also retrieved an album of already developed prints. Mind you put your old diary in my bag, as it has been kept rather more regularly than mine, I believe, Shackleton had said to Lees as they abandoned ship. At the back of his mind were the book and story rights he had sold in advance to finance the expedition. Hurley's photographs would be similarly valuable. 3 tons of salvaged provisions were eventually carried back to Ocean Camp on dog sledges and stored in the former wheelhouse, now nicknamed the Rabbit Hutch. The new camp gained shape. In the centre stood the galley, built of sails and spars, and containing a stove that Hurley had constructed with a chisel from the ship's ash chute. Nearby stood the line of 3 domed and 2 pole tents, close to which the dogs were pegged out in their teams. A platform of deck planking and spars served as a lookout, over which were flown the flags of the King and the Royal Clyde Yacht Club. A routine was established. At 8:30 a.m. breakfast was served, consisting of fried seal, lumps of baked dough called bannocks, and tea. Each tent appointed a messman, whose job was to bring meals from the galley to the tent. After breakfast, parties went out scouting for seals, or did chores around the camp until lunch at 1 p.m. Afternoons were spent as one chose, generally reading, darning, or walking. At 5:30, penguin stew, hoosh, was served with cocoa, and immediately afterward the crew settled into their sleeping bags. Our watches were set throughout the night to guard against dogs coming adrift, or to warn the camp of a sudden break-up of the floe. The sledging rations originally intended for the continental crossing had been among the first articles evacuated from the ship before the break-up, and were now scrupulously reserved for the boat journey, which was projected to be only a month or 2 away. Estimates of how long the rest of the salvaged food could last varied from personality to personality. According to Hurley, there was now sufficient food in the camp, augmented with seals and penguins, to last the party 9 months. Lee's practised calculations nearer the mark did not extend much beyond 100 days. Shackleton allocated a pound of food per man per day, a diet that was uncomfortably frugal, but far from starvation. The men's main criticism at this point concerned the monotony of the fare. Shackleton's tent assignments were characteristically astute. He collected with him the ones he thought wouldn't mix with the others. They were not so easy to get on with, the ones he had in his tent with him. They were quite a mixed bag, according to Greenstreet. With Shackleton in tent number 1 were Hurley, Hudson, and James. James had proved to be fair game for teasing and baiting, and his inclusion was for his own good. Hurley was included because his vanity was flattered by being with the boss. Shackleton was very wary of Hurley. whose undoubted competence and somewhat glamorous professional background had won him a following early in the expedition. In terms of mental and physical toughness, Hurley was up with Wild and Crean, but he lacked their unquestionable loyalty. Consequently, Shackleton took pains to consult with Hurley and to include him in all conferences of any importance. Wild, Wordie, McElroy, and McNish shared tent number 2, Shackleton placing the dour carpenter squarely in the midst of men he regarded as solid under Wild's eye. Tent number 3, a large domed construction, held the 8 men from the forecastle: Howe, Bakewell, McCarthy, McLeod, Vincent, Holness, Stevenson, and Green, who would have expected to remain together. Crean had charge of the generally unproblematic tent number 4, with Hussey, Marston, and Cheetham, and Worsley was in charge of tent number 5, the other large tent, with Greenstreet, Lees, Clark, Kerr, Rickinson, Macklin, and Blackborough. The days passed in largely unrelieved, but not altogether unpleasant, idleness. Apart from speculations on the progress of the war in Europe, the most impassioned conversations concerned the weather, the wind, and the rate of ice drift. The blizzard still continues, but we all hope it lasts for a month, as we have done 16 miles northwest since our last observation, McNish wrote on November 6th, the day of their first heavy snowstorm on the ice. The direction as well as rate of the drift was all important. Ideally, the generally prevailing northwest current would take them to the long arm of the Palmer Peninsula, in the vicinity of Snow Hill, Robertson, or Paulet Islands. On the other hand, there was a danger that drift might stray to the northeast or east, away from land. It was also possible, of course, that the pack would stall, in which case they would face another winter on the ice. In mid-November, the weather turned unusually mild, with temperatures in the upper 20s and even 30s. Although the warmth was welcomed as a sign of the impending breakup of the pack, living conditions in general became less comfortable. The camp was mired in slush, through which the men slogged, sometimes falling through rotten snow into hidden pools of water. Inside their tents the temperature could rise to as much as 70 degrees, now considered oppressively hot. All the tents were supplied with makeshift wooden floors, built of salvaged dog kennel and ship timber, but even these could not keep their sleeping bags entirely above the pools of water. At night, temperatures fell to 0, cold enough for the men's breath to precipitate as a light snow powder in the tents. Inside, the men lay head to toe like sardines in a tin, with no room to turn and nowhere to tread when they went out or came in. Inevitably, minor tensions were exacerbated. Tent walls are very thin, Lees wrote, thinner than this paper, and they have ears on both sides, inside and outside, and many other scrappy bits one hears, which one didn't ought to hear. The role Lees himself came to play in the group was both fascinating and pathetic. In addition to his many other irritating traits, he was a snorer, and in early November he reported in his diary that "there is a movement on foot to eject me from the 8-man pole tent and make me sleep in the rabbit hutch." This campaign was successful, and shortly afterward Lees busily put the finishing touches to the sleeping accommodations in the storeroom. Sounds of bitter sobs and lamentations are heard this evening from number 5 tent at the loss of their dearly beloved colonel, who has removed himself for a season to sleep in his store in the old wheelhouse, Worsley wrote facetiously. Given Shackleton's almost obsessive care to keep his group together, physically and morally, it is striking that he allowed Lees to go off or be driven off in this manner. Yet there were clear reasons why he should have wanted Lees neutralized. A human being's normal diet should contain the 3 main constituents of food: protein, fat, and carbohydrates, in the proportion of 1 to 1 to 2.5 respectively, whatever the actual weights. Lees recorded in his diary in a typical entry, i.e. the carbohydrates, farinaceous foods, and sugar, should be more than double the other 2. As it is, our flour will only last for another 10 weeks at the most, and so on, and so on. The sight of Lee's nakedly anxious face, his incessant fussy inventory-taking and worried pronouncements of shortages must have driven Shackleton wild. It did not help matters that Lee's observations were entirely correct, but Lees does not appear to have grasped the single salient fact of the crew's predicament, that by all rational calculations their situation was not merely desperate, but impossible. Any strategy for survival, therefore, could not completely defer to reality. Shackleton's tactics always involved a dangerous gamble of morale against practical necessity. The last thing he needed was for the men to hear Lee's grim invocations of the laws of science and reason. Hence a move to ostracize Lees or undermine his credibility could only have been welcomed by Shackleton. On the other hand, certain practical measures could be taken, such as the preparation of the boats for their inevitable journey. "I've been busy since Saturday finishing the sledge for the boat," wrote McNish on November 16th, "and now I am building the boat up 1 foot higher, and decking her in, halfway making her fit to carry the whole party in case we have to make a longer journey than we anticipate at present." The work was done with his only surviving tools, a saw, hammer, chisel, and adze. Less than 2 weeks later he had finished all 3 boats, but was still tinkering. "I've started to raise the Dudley Docker a strake higher at my leisure," he wrote. "It is past time for me, and it makes the boat carry more and more seaworthy." Everyone who stopped by was impressed by his work. In mid-December McNish was still tinkering with the boats. It was, as he said, past time. The particular object of his care was the 22-foot-long whaler christened the James Caird, after the expedition's principal benefactor. The boat had been commissioned by Worsley and built in the Thames dockyard according to his specifications. Her planking was Baltic pine, keel and timbers American elm, and stem and sternpost English oak, according to Worsley. One of McNish's refinements was to put chafing battens on her bow, as he said, to keep the young ice from cutting through, as she is built of white pine, which won't last long in ice. In lieu of the usual caulking materials, oakum and pitch, McNish had filled the seams with lampwick and sealed them with Marston's oil paints. The nails he used had been extracted from salvaged timber of the Endurance. The landscape around them was subtly changed with the thaw. The convoluted ice fields had softened and were threaded with small, broken leads of water. The days were very long, with the sun rising at 3 a.m. and setting at 9 p.m. The crew passed the time by hunting seals amid the slush, playing cards, and arguing over articles in the Encyclopaedia Britannica. In tent number 5, Clark read aloud from Science from an Easy Chair. Sing-songs were still held in the evenings. Marston resoled everyone's boots, and Hurley was absorbed with improvising crampons for the march to the west from Snow Hill Island. On the evening of November 21st, shortly after the dogs had been fed, as the company read and chatted quietly in their tents, they heard Shackleton call out, "She's going!" Hurrying outside to the lookout platform and other points of vantage, the men looked out to see the last moments of the Endurance. Her stern rising high in the air, she went down bows first in one quick dive. There was a queer silence over the camp, according to Bakewell. As for me, there was an odd lump in my throat, and I found it hard to swallow. We were now very lonely. "She's gone, boys," Shackleton said quietly from the lookout post. In his own diary he wrote, "At 5 p.m. she went down by the head. The stern, the cause of all the trouble, was the last to go under water. I cannot write about it." As the thaw continued, leads of open water increased, making the still occasional salvage trips to dump camp and hunting excursions increasingly dangerous. It was with great difficulty that the dog teams negotiated paths through the ever-changing maze of open lanes to collect seals killed earlier by scouting hunters. The floe, on which they were encamped, had rotated as much as 15 degrees to the east in the loosening ice, yet the pack as a whole showed no signs of breaking up. Really, Sir Ernest does not at all ignore the possibility of having to remain on the floe until it reaches the vicinity of the South Orkneys, Lees reported, but he does not like it to be discussed for fear of creating a feeling of despondency, especially among the sailors. Old landmarks drifted regally across the waterlogged, slurry landscape. The crew's old friend, the Rampart Berg, was now a mere 5 miles distant, and appeared to be dark blue, a sign that it might be floating in open water. Thick mist sometimes obscured the landscape. Wet snow fell, and once actual rain. In late November, a blue sky gave way to showers of hail that fell on the tents with a sound that reminded Wordie of heavy rain on trees. They were drifting northwest at a rate of a little more than 2 miles a day. December was not an easy month for Shackleton. Towards the end of November he had come down with an attack of sciatica, which worsened over the following days, until he was unable to leave his sleeping bag without assistance. It could not have been helped by his lying in a wool bag on waterlogged timber. Worse, his confinement removed him somewhat from the goings-on in camp. James, who shared Shackleton's tent, noted that he was constantly on the watch for any break in morale or any discontent, so that he could deal with it at once. Above all else, Shackleton feared losing his grip on his men. The period of illness made him anxious and restive, and when he finally recovered, some 2 weeks later, he emerged from his tent not altogether in the best of spirits. "Boss hauls cook over the coals for making doughy bannocks," Hurley recorded on Shackleton's first day up and about. The men too were restless, the sailors in particular showing worrisome signs of disaffection. The entire company monitored the drift of their flow more intently than ever. "Once across the Antarctic Circle, 66.31, it will seem as if we are practically halfway home again," Lees noted on December 12th. "And it is just possible that with favouring winds we may cross the circle before the new year." Only a few days later, a strong blizzard arising from the south promised to speed them over the magic line even sooner than anticipated. But on December 18th, the wind swung around from the northeast, driving them back the way they had come. More disconcerting was the fact that their drift fluctuated between northwest and a subtle veer to the east, away from land. Shackleton discussed with Wild and Hurley the possibility of making another attempt to march to land, partly to forestall the ominous hint of an eastward drift, partly because, as Wild agreed, a spell of hard work would do everybody good. On the 20th, the three men set out to scout the conditions. "Found the surface and conditions good, there being about 75% of splendid going," Hurley reported optimistically. Shackleton broke the news to the rest of the company that they would be on the march again on December 23rd, the day after Midsummer's Day, which was to be celebrated as Christmas. The announcement of this second march came as an unwelcome shock to many. "As far as I have seen, the going will be awful," wrote Greenstreet, "everything being in a state of softness far worse than when we left the ship, and in my opinion it would be a measure to be taken only as a last resort, and I sincerely hope he will give up the idea directly. There have been great arguments about the matter in our tent." Despite the grand blowout feast for Christmas, the breaking of camp on the early morning of the 23rd was not accomplished in universally high spirits. Shackleton had determined that they should travel at night, when the surface of the ice was hardest, and consequently the men were awakened at 3 in the morning on a foggy, dreary day. The abortive first march had been undertaken with genuine optimism. On the second march, many set out in resigned, half-hearted obedience. 18 men, straining in harness, relayed 2 of the boats ahead over the now precarious ice. Then all hands returned to pack up the remaining supplies. Tents, galleys, stores, sledges were dragged as far as the boats, where a new camp was pitched. The third boat was left behind at Ocean Camp. At the end of the first day of 8 hours marching, they had covered approximately 1¼ miles. The following days passed in the same dreary and unrewarding routine. Never entirely rested, their hunger never entirely satisfied, and their clothes always wet, the men strained and slipped at their loads over the hummocked and slushy ice, averaging for hours of labour 1.5 miles a day. Shackleton's plan had been that they would pull west for 60 miles. By now, even he must have known they would never make this mark. "A harder, more discouraging march I've never had the misfortune to participate in," wrote Bakewell. On December 27th, silent doubts and resentments became dramatically apparent. "The skipper had trouble with the carpenter today, whilst sledging," wrote Wordie. "Tonight the company assembled on the floe and the ship's articles were read. After struggling over a particularly bad section of ice for 2 hours, McNish dug in his heels and announced in abusive language he would go no farther. Shackleton was up ahead with the pioneering party, and it was left to Worsley, who was in charge of the boat haulers, to tackle McNish. This he proved incapable of doing. There had always been tension between the two men. Had the boat haulers been under the command of anyone else, the incident might not have arisen. In any case, a flustered Worsley sent for Shackleton, who hastened back from the head of the column. McNish was exhausted, wet through, suffering from piles, and still heartsick over the loss of his pet, Mrs. Chippy. For weeks he had complained that he had not been allowed to salvage wood from the Endurance to build a sloop that would carry them all to freedom. Others shared his disappointment. The old salt now turned sea lawyer, arguing that his duty to obey orders had terminated with the abandonment of the Endurance. Hard words were exchanged between the two men. Technically, McNish's contention was correct. Nonetheless, Shackleton called a muster and read aloud the ship's articles, with a few elaborations of his own. He informed his men that they would be paid up until the day they reached safe port, not, as under normal articles, only until the loss of their ship. Consequently, the men were bound by his orders until that time. McNish cooled down, and the situation passed. But Shackleton remained conscious of the narrowly averted danger. More had been at stake than one disgruntled seaman. Not only had McNish disobeyed orders at a moment of critically low morale, but it also, as it were, defied Shackleton's optimistic pronouncements. It was now impossible to pretend that their painful efforts held any hope of success. Perhaps Shackleton's muttering critics had been right, and they should not have moved from Ocean Camp. Perhaps Chippy could have built his sloop. McNish's brief rebellion had suggested the unthinkable, that the boss was capable of significant error. In this fraught context, Shackleton's reluctant decision to suspend the march 2 days later was both bitter and courageous. The ice ahead was completely unnegotiable, forcing not only a halt but a retreat of half a mile to stronger footing. The men retired at 10 p.m. without a meal. "Turned in but could not sleep," Shackleton wrote in his diary. "Thought the whole matter over and decided to retreat to more secure ice. It is the only safe thing to do. Am anxious. Everyone working well except the carpenter. I shall never forget him in this time of strain and stress." A sturdy-looking floe was chosen for the new camp, but the following day the opening of a deep crack forced them to shift again. The ice, they now discovered, was not as stable as it had been at their previous camp. "All the floes in the neighbourhood appear to be saturated by the sea to the very surface," wrote Worsley. "So much that on cutting 1 inch below the surface of a 6 or 7 feet thick floe, water almost at once flows into the hole." But the men were stuck. The floes behind them had disintegrated too much for further retreat. A week's back-breaking labour had gained the party 8 miles. Behind them, at Ocean Camp, lay additional stores, books, clothing, an efficient stove, wood for the floors of their tents, a comfortable routine. Moreover, the boats they dragged with them, at such cost, had been damaged by the journey. "I heard the carpenter say that if we had to go over much more such rough ice, the boats would not float when we did reach open water," Bakewell recalled. One can be sure McNish took pains to make this piece of information widely known. He'd got his revenge. Above all else, the sailors feared damage to the precious boats. Despite all bitter setbacks and second thoughts, life on the floes had to be re-established. The tents were set up in a line along the treacherous snow parallel to the dogs. "We have called our camp Patience Camp," wrote Lees. It was now January 1916, and still the pack showed no sign of breakup. Moreover, the wind had stalled, keeping the crew just short of the 66th parallel. The days and weeks passed with renewed tedium and moody tension. "Playing a game of wait always wearies one's patience," Hurley wrote, with uncharacteristic impatience. He was normally as resilient to their circumstances as any member of the expedition. To pass the time, the men took walks around the perimeter of their floe, read, played bridge, and lay in their sleeping bags. McNish ostentatiously recorked the damaged boats using seal blood. Their predicament was now analysed as it had not been before. "The boss at any rate has changed his mind yet once again," wrote Wordie dryly. "He now intends waiting for leads, and just as firmly believes he will get them, as he did a week ago that the ice would be fit for sledging the boats at the rate of 10 miles a day." Shackleton himself was preoccupied and moody, and not at all amenable to well-intentioned suggestions. Lees was openly frantic over the state of their supplies, and daily roamed off on unauthorized seal hunts across the rotting ice. Worsley was eventually put in charge of minding him. Greenstreet's suggestion that every seal and penguin that approached the camp should be killed and stored was met with impatience by Shackleton. "Oh," he said, according to Greenstreet, "you're a bloody pessimist. That would put the wind up the forecastle crowd. They'd think we were never going to get out." But food had become a real worry. Seals had been scarce, and supplies of meat and blubber were dwindling. On January 14th, the teams of Wild, Crean, McElroy, and Marston were shot, 27 dogs in all. No more use was envisioned for them, and the food they consumed had become too valuable. Their dog pemmican would become a staple of the men's diet. "This duty fell upon me, and was the worst job I ever had in my life," Wild reported. "I've known many men I would rather shoot than the worst of the dogs." This necessity upset all the men. "One of the saddest events since we left home," as McNish recorded. The same evening, Hurley and Macklin were authorized to make a dangerous run with their teams to Ocean Camp. With some difficulty they returned, with 900 pounds of stores the following day. This was the last run for Hurley's team. "Wild shot my team during the afternoon," Hurley wrote, then bade farewell to his favourite dog. "Hail to thee, old leader, Shakespeare. I shall ever remember thee, fearless, faithful, and diligent." At last, on January 21st, after a month of maddening calm, a blizzard from the southwest blew them across the Arctic Circle into familiar waters. They were now within 150 miles of Snow Hill Island, although very much to its east. Shackleton celebrated the occasion by issuing each man an extra bannock. Nevertheless, an excursion made some days later by Wordie and Worsley to a nearby berg revealed that the long-awaited Breakup was nowhere in sight. "Ice almost everywhere," Wordie reported, after having climbed the berg for a lookout position. Because seals were scarce, their stores of blubber were now dwindling. To conserve fuel, Shackleton cut down the daily ration of hot drinks to a single cup of tea in the morning. At the end of January, the vagaries of the pack rotated their old ocean camp to within less than 6 miles, and ironically in a more desirable westerly position than they themselves now held. On February 2nd, Shackleton authorized the retrieval of the third boat that had been left behind, the Stancomb Wills. "It has taken a long time to persuade the boss to this move," Wordie noted, "and I doubt if he would have done it, had it not been for the general feeling in camp. No one believed that the 2 boats alone could have contained the whole company." Shackleton had resisted authorizing the trip, being morbidly afraid of losing men to unnecessary accidents. But with all 3 boats safe in camp, everyone was in better spirits, the sailors in particular, although this was generally thought to be as much because of the big bundle of salvaged items they had secreted into their tent as to the arrival of the Stancomb Wills. Time continued to drag on. Shackleton ordered the refuse pile of old seal bones, flippers, and discarded bits and pieces, picked over for blubber. The seal question was getting very serious. They were now running short of not only blubber for fuel, but meat for food. "So there's nothing for it but get into our sleeping bags and smoke away the hunger," wrote McNish. "What Prime Minister Lloyd George calls a luxury for working men." Wet weather and driving snow kept the men inside their tents, while the tents themselves were more sodden than ever. The ground sheet of tent number 5 had been commandeered to make a sail for one of the boats. In its stead, oilskin jackets and trousers, 2 blankets, and a sea leopard skin were now all that lay between the sleeping bags and wet snow. Several of the tents had been rent by gales, and were in any case so thin that a gust of wind outside blew cigarette smoke within. In early February, Lees was rebuked by Shackleton for making pessimistic statements. "It is well to record these little sidelights on expeditionary life," wrote Lees, with no sign of ill feeling, "as they are usually expunged from the published books, or at most left to be read between the lines." Shackleton had continued to restrict Lee's seal-hunting excursions, claiming incorrectly that enough meat had been laid by to last a month. This restriction alienated even the loyal Worsley, and Shackleton's optimism was meeting with private cynicism on many fronts. "His sublime optimism all the way through being, to my mind, absolute foolishness," wrote Greenstreet. "Everything right away through was going to turn out all right, and no notice was taken of things possibly turning out otherwise, and here we are." It is hard to judge Shackleton's rationale. He could not have been more keenly attuned to the moods of his men, and none of their discontent on this issue could have escaped him. Moreover, he was not one to let his pride prevent him from reversing a bad decision. Rather, Shackleton's dogged resistance to laying by more than a few weeks' supply of food was governed by a carefully reasoned ethic. His main concern was always for the morale of the sailors, and none of these men left diaries, so it is impossible to determine their state of mind. From other accounts one gleans suggestions that they were both more despondent and more troublesome than was ever directly stated. The wardroom members, the officers and scientists had come south with the expectation of wintering on the ice and of making sledging excursions. Lee's thoughts at the start of the ill-fated second march are illuminating. "Were it not for a little natural anxiety as to our ultimate progress, I have never been happier in my life than I am now. For is not this kind of existence the real thing, the thing I have for years set my heart on?" He had set his heart on a taste of the man-hauling epics of Scott's heroic age, and it was precisely for such an experience that many of the men had joined Shackleton. But not the sailors. Their lives centered on their ships, and their ship had been lost. And while they too had come south with Shackleton for adventure, sagas of man-hauling stoicism were not in their frames of reference. They did not wish to entertain the possibility of spending another winter on the ice. They wanted to take the boats. Shackleton's prime objective was to keep his men unified, and this may have necessitated some apparently illogical decisions. Towards the end of February, the sudden appearance of a flock of little Adelie penguins came as a boon to the hungry men. 300 were taken. Their flesh served as food, their skins as fuel for the galley stove. The temperatures had started to fall, and the men complained of feeling cold even in their bags. "I've had no sleep for the last 2 nights with the cold," wrote McNish. Shackleton visited the tents in turn, settling in each to spin yarns, recite poetry, or play bridge. "The food now is pretty well all meat," Greenstreet wrote. "Seal steaks, stewed seal, penguin steaks, stewed penguin, penguin liver. The cocoa has been finished for some time, and the tea is very nearly done. Flour also is very nearly finished. With Lees and Green, the cook, Shackleton fretted over the daily menu, conspiring with them to make it more satisfying. Seals and penguins permitting, special occasions were celebrated to break the monotony. In honour of Leap Year Day, and the escape of some of our bachelors from the fair sex, we have 3 full meals with a hot beverage to each, Worsley wrote on February 29th, and so we all feel well fed and happy tonight. The drift of the pack was once again averaging 2 miles per day. By early March they were only 70 miles from Paulet Island. Snow Hill Island already lay behind them. On March 7th a blizzard arose, the heaviest snowfall since they had entered the ice. Too cold to read or play cards, the men lay in the tents, huddled in bags that had frozen as stiff as sheet iron. 2 days later, digging out sledges and gear from the 4 feet of drift that had fallen, a curious motion was detected in the pack, the swell of the ocean beneath them. The following day, Shackleton organised drills to practice loading the boats, so as to be ready at a moment's notice in the event their floe broke under them. The ice parted some days later, but then quickly closed again. Still they drifted north, moving farther and farther up the Palmer Peninsula. They were drawing abreast of Paulet Island. On March 21st, the first day of winter, the hours of light shrank each day as the weather grew colder. On the morning of March 23rd, Shackleton sighted land to the west. "There's been a lot of doubt in the skipper's part," wrote McNish, with sardonic satisfaction, "as he never saw it first. After being on the lookout this last 2 months and reporting so many bergs as being land, he is feeling quite sick over it being seen by anyone else." But it was true land, the jagged snow-covered ridges of Joinville Island, the first land the men had seen in 16 months. "If the ice opens, we could land in a day," Hurley wrote. But the ice didn't open. Still the pack held, too loose to cross on foot, too close to sail, and still it drifted north. Day by day Shackleton silently watched as his worst fears were realised. They were approaching the very farthest tip of the Palmer Peninsula. Soon there would be no more land ahead. On March 30th the last of the dogs were shot, and the younger ones eaten. There were no expressions of regret this time, only grim acceptance of the necessity and pleasure at the unexpected tastiness of their meat. Several big seals were also killed, and the men had their first good feed in 2 weeks. The sledging rations were still held, relatively untouched, in reserve. "Such a life ages one," Hurley noted in his diary. That same night, March 31st, their floe was riven by a crack that separated the men from the boats. Shackleton set all hands on watch and watch, half the camp on duty at all times, but the ice held throughout the rest of the night. Days of heavy wind followed, and the men lay in their bags with nothing to do but talk, while the floe bumped under them. Lees became seasick. Worsley's sightings indicated that the floe was travelling faster than the wind was blowing it. Evidently, the disintegrating pack was now in the grip of strong currents. At dawn on April 7th, daylight revealed the precipitous snow-streaked mountains of Clarence Island. Later in the day, the sharp peaks of Elephant Island showed just west of north. With almost bewildering speed, the drift now carried them directly north towards the islands. It then veered alarmingly to the west, beyond striking range of either island, then swerved east again, bringing the 2 islands directly ahead. Every day saw new contingencies and necessitated new plans. Wildlife became abundant, with gulls, petrels, and terns overhead, and whales blowing in the leads. On the evening of April 8th, the ice cracked once again, right under the James Caird. Pitching like a ship at sea, the floe broke down to a triangle, measuring some 90 by 100 by 120 yards. "I felt that the time for launching the boats was near at hand," wrote Shackleton. After breakfast on April 9th, camp was struck and the boats prepared. The men ate a last good meal while standing at the ready. At 1 p.m. Shackleton gave the long-awaited order to launch the boats. Positions had been designated months before. The James Caird, the large whaler, was commanded by Shackleton and Wild, and on board were Clark, Hurley, Hussey, James, Wordie, McNish, Green, Vincent, and McCarthy. In the Dudley Docker, under the command of Worsley, were Greenstreet, Kerr, Lees, Macklin, Cheetham, Marston, MacLeod, and Holness. And in the smallest and least seaworthy boat, the Stancomb Wills, Rickinson, McElroy, Howe, Bakewell, Blackborough, and Stevenson were under the command of Hudson and Crean. At 1:30 p.m. the boats pushed off. There was a heavy swell, and the lanes of open water zigzagged erratically between the lurching floes. "Our first day in the water was one of the coldest and most dangerous of the expedition," wrote Bakewell. "The ice was running riot. It was a hard race to keep our boats in the open leads. We had many narrow escapes from being crushed when the larger masses of the pack would come together. The men had been trapped in the ice for 15 months, but their real ordeal had just begun." In the boats. 4:10:16. Last night a night of tension and anxiety, on a par with the night of the ship's destruction. Sea and wind increase, and have to draw up onto an old isolated floe, and pray to God it will remain entire throughout the night. No sleep for 48 hours. All wet, cold and miserable, with a northeast blizzard raging. No sight of land, and pray for cessation of these wild conditions. Frank Hurley, Diary. In the gathering dusk of the first night at sea, Shackleton and his men camped on a floe measuring some 200 by 100 feet, which rocked visibly in the ocean swell. Darkness came early, at around 7 p.m., but it was a mild evening, with the temperature around 18 degrees. After a hot meal cooked by Green on the blubber stove, the men retired to their tents. Some intangible feeling of uneasiness made me leave my tent about 11 p.m. that night and glance around the quiet camp, Shackleton wrote. I started to walk across the floes in order to warn the watchman to look carefully for cracks, and as I was passing the men's tent, the floe lifted on the crest of a swell and cracked right under my feet. As Shackleton watched, the crack ran beneath the sailor's tent and emptied Howe and Holness, who was still in his bag, into the water. Howe struggled out, and Shackleton, grasping Holness's bag, hove it onto the ice before the edges of the floe clamped together again. There was no more sleep that night. Hudson generously offered dry clothes to Holness, who was grumbling that he had lost his tobacco. Shackleton issued hot milk and Strymer's polar nut food, a treat from the uncracked sledging rations, to all hands, who huddled around the blubber stove. From the leads of dark water around them, the blowing of the killer whales punctuated the long hours of the night. When dawn broke at 6 a.m., the men discovered that the floe was surrounded by loose ice. While all hands waited anxiously for an opening to clear, a dangerous swell was growing, crashing the ice fragments together, as Lees noted, with a force sufficient to smash a moderately sized yacht. By the time the boats were launched at 8 a.m., the wind was high and squally, at times reaching gale force. For 2 hours the men rowed against the heavy swell through a tortuous network of channels and leads, then through survival ice, old hummocky floes and brash at the outer margins of the pack. The crew's all-meat diet had taken a toll, as Lees had predicted. Lacking even minimal carbohydrates over the past months, the men working the oars were soon exhausted. A light haze had descended upon an otherwise mild day, obscuring their intended landfall, Clarence or Elephant Island, now a mere 60 or so miles distant. The overloaded, unwieldy boats did not allow for refinements in navigation. The Stancomb Wills, in particular, was already cause for grave concern, lacking the canvas to keep abreast of her more seaworthy companions. Shackleton had given orders that all three were to stay in hailing distance of one another, but this was not always easily accomplished. Amid towering icebergs of fantastic shapes, the boats nosed their way closer and closer towards the edge of the ice. But when they finally broke triumphantly through it, they were hit head-on by a high sea, unbuffered by the pack. Abruptly, Shackleton ordered them back inside. Reluctant to head due north through open, running sea, they now turned their course west, towards King George Island. At dusk, the boats turned to a circular floe, some 20 yards across, and made camp. Later in the night, the wind rose, dropping snow and rocking their camp with heavy swell. Chunks of the floe broke off in the wind-whipped waves, but Shackleton, who had remained up all night with the watchman, McNish, deemed the camp to be in no immediate danger and let the men sleep. Or try to. Hurley's diary indicates there were no illusions inside the tents about the safety of their position. By dawn, a huge swell was running under overcast, misty skies that turned to snowy squalls. Heavy undulations of ice swept towards them. Shackleton, Worsley, and Wild took turns climbing to the peak of their rocking berg, searching for a break of open water in the ice, while the men stood by the boats and waited. As the hours passed, their floe, grinding against loose pack, became gradually smaller. One of the anxieties in my mind was the possibility that we would be driven by the current through the 80-mile gap between Clarence Island and Prince George Island, as it was then called, into the open Atlantic, wrote Shackleton. By noon, the squalls had slackened, and when a lane of open water appeared, the boats rushed into it. They had set out late in the day, with dusk falling at 5 p.m. Few hours of light remained for sailing, and come nightfall they were still amid the loose pack. As before, a suitable floe was found for a camp, and Green and his blubber stove were disembarked. But it quickly became apparent that the floe could not serve them through the night, and Shackleton reluctantly determined that they would have to sleep in the boats. Several hours of desultory rowing brought them under the lee of a heavy old floe, where the boats were moored alongside one another for the night. Constant rain and snow squalls blotted out the stars and soaked us through, Shackleton wrote. Occasionally the ghostly shadows of silver, snow, and fulmar petrels flashed close to us, and all around we could hear the killers blowing their short, sharp hisses, sounding like sudden escapes of steam. A school of killer whales had languidly drifted around the boats, their sleek, sinister black forms surrounding them on every side for the duration of the long night. Of all the memories the men would carry with them, this, the slow, measured rising of the white-throated whales in the dark waters around their boats, remained one of the most terrible and abiding. In their long months on the ice, the men had borne abundant witness to the great beast's ice-shattering power. Whether they would attack humans, no one really knew. For the men, these were prodigies of the deep, mysterious and evil, possessed of chilling reptilian eyes that betrayed disconcerting mammalian intelligence. Seasick and sleepless, the men bumped and jostled endlessly amid the ice and whales. It was this night that began to break the will of many. Regarding his companions in the cold dawn that followed, Shackleton noted simply that the strain was beginning to tell. He promised a hot breakfast, and the men manned the oars to seek out a suitable floe, their frozen Burberry suits cracking and shedding shards of ice as they pulled. At 8 o'clock the galley was landed on a floe. By 9 o'clock they were underway again. Around them, basking in the welcome sunshine, hundreds of seals lounged comfortably on floes flushed pink by the sunrise. They had been travelling roughly northwest since the day they left Patience Camp. Now, under hazy sunshine, Worsley balanced himself against the mast of the Dudley Docker to take the first noon observation the weather had allowed. Expectations were high as to the miles gained, but the results were worse than anyone would have dreamed possible. A terrible disappointment, wrote Worsley in his diary. Not a single mile had been gained. Instead, they had drifted to the southeast, 30 miles east of their position at Patience Camp and 11 miles south. A strong easterly current, concealed by the heavy swell, combined with a tortuous navigation through sinuous lanes, had obscured all sense of direction. Shackleton tried to downplay the bad news, saying only that they had not done as well as expected. It was 3 in the afternoon, and dusk came at 5. King George and Deception Islands to the west were now out of reach. Elephant Island to the north, the closest land, lay outside the pack in high seas. Behind them, to the southwest, Hope Bay, on the tip of the Palmer Peninsula, was 130 miles away, in water that was for the moment clear. After consulting with Worsley and Wild, Shackleton opted to take advantage of the northwest wind and turn the boats back towards Hope Bay. By nightfall they found themselves amid loose, fragmented ice in a choppy sea. The weather was becoming colder and wetter, and as on the previous night, no floe could be found large enough to establish a camp. Eventually the boats were tethered one behind the other and moored to the lee side of a large chunk of ice. At 9 o'clock a shift in the wind blew back the clouds, revealing a bright moon, but also drifting the boats against the jagged floe. Hastily the painter of the lead boat, the James Caird, was cut, and with no other mooring available, the 3 small vessels drifted through the night in a sea of brash ice. The temperature had dropped, and new pancakes of ice had formed on the water's surface. Shivering together in each other's arms, some of the men tried to snatch minutes of sleep. Many preferred to row or fend off the chunks of ice that sped their way, anything to keep their cold arms moving. Occasionally, from an almost clear sky, came snow showers, wrote Shackleton, falling silently on the sea and laying a thin shroud of white over our bodies and our boats. Lees in the Dudley Docker had appropriated the only complete set of oilskins, which he adamantly refused to share. As his snoring indicated, he for one found sleep possible. When a foggy dawn at last put an end to the night, the crew discovered that the boats were sheathed in ice, inside and out. The temperature in the night had dropped to -7 degrees. As the ice was hacked off with axes, lumps were distributed to the men to eat. Most of the men were now looking seriously worn and strained, Shackleton wrote. Their lips were cracked and their eyes and eyelids showed red in their salt-encrusted faces. Obviously, we must make land quickly, and I decided to run for Elephant Island. The wind had shifted again, blowing now from the southeast. Shackleton's decision to change course again, and at any cost, make for the nearest land, was determined by the realization that he was now racing for the very lives of many of his men. He could no longer afford the luxury of caution. As the boats ran before the wind for Elephant Island, a man in the bow of each attempted to fend away lumps of brash, while they plunged precariously down leads in the thin new ice. The wind grew stronger, and the boats made their way once again to the edge of the pack, and by noon had crashed into deep sapphire waters. With the sun out, the wind favourable and strong, they raced towards their destination. By 4 in the afternoon, the wind had increased to a gale that blew surging waves into the boats, compounding the men's misery. The Stanton Wills alone had not had her gunwales raised, and water poured in over stores and men. From the James Caird, Shackleton, sensing a need to lift morale, if only in some small way, distributed extra food to all hands. A number, overcome with seasickness, could not take advantage of this bonus. Many were suffering from dysentery from uncooked dog pemmican, and were forced to relieve themselves over the side of the surging boats, balancing on the gunwales. Shackleton's order that the boats stay in hailing distance of one another became increasingly difficult to obey. The Stanton Wills was knee-deep in water, and Holness, one of the trawler hands who previously made his living braving the icy North Atlantic, covered his face and wept with sheer terror and misery. Worsley, drawing abreast of the James Caird, suggested to Shackleton that they run through the night, but Shackleton, wary as ever of splitting his party, and afraid they might even overrun the island in the darkness, gave the order to lay to. It was a hard decision to make. "I doubted if all the men would survive that night," he stated simply. On top of all else, they had no water. Usually ice was taken on board at each campsite, but the hasty departure from the veering floe the night before had made this impossible. Tormented by the salt spray flung continually in their faces, the men's mouths were swollen and their lips bloody. Frozen raw seal meat provided the only relief. Sea anchors, made of canvas and oars lashed together, were flung overboard, and there began the third night in the boats. Through all the demanding days and all the long and terrible hours of darkness, the helmsmen, Wild and McNish, Hudson and Crean, Worsley and Greenstreet, had remained immovable at their posts as waves crashed over them, as their clothes froze upon them, as the wind and spray stung their tired faces. The wind subsided in the night, and at dawn the sleepless men beheld the glorious mauve sunrise that flashed on the eastern horizon, and only 30 miles directly ahead lay Clarence Island, its snow-clad peak glowing in the dawn. Later, in full daylight, Elephant Island appeared, exactly on the bearings that Worsley had calculated. In Shackleton's words, with 2 days' dead reckoning while following a devious course through the pack ice, and after drifting during 2 nights at the mercy of wind and waves. Elephant Island was the less precipitous of the two. Additionally, it lay to windward, ensuring that if the boats missed their first attempted landfall, they would have Clarence Island as alternative to their lee. The night had taken its toll. At least half the party were insane, according to Wild. Fortunately not violent, simply helpless and hopeless. The Stanton Wills drew abreast of the Caird, to report that Hudson had collapsed after 72 hours at the helm, and Blackborough reported that there was something wrong with his feet. Continual immersion in salt water had caused the eruption of painful boils on many men. Their bodies were badly chafed, and their mouths throbbed with thirst. As the wind died, they took to the oars, a task made painful by the blisters on their hands. By 3 in the afternoon the boats were only 10 miles from land, the harsh glaciers and icy mountains of Elephant Island now discernible in fine detail. At this point the men encountered a strong tidal current that held the boats at bay. After a solid hour of rowing at the pitch of their strength, they were not so much as a mile closer to the island. At 5 o'clock, lowering skies to the northwest darkened, and shortly afterward a storm broke. There would be no landfall after all, but another night in the pitching boats. We were in the midst of confused, lumpy seas, which running from 2 directions were far more dangerous for small boats than the straight-running waves of a heavy gale in open seas, Worsley wrote. The boats could never settle down, and to steer became a work of art. Now all 3 boats were bailed continuously. In the belaboured Stanton Wills, 4 of the 8 men were completely incapacitated. McElroy, Howe, and Bakewell bailed through the night for their lives and those of their shipmates, while Crean held the tiller. In the James Caird, McNish relieved Wild at the helm, but briefly fell asleep, exhausted. Wild, unshaken, unchanged, took over again, his steel blue eyes, as Shackleton recorded with affectionate pride, looking out to the day ahead. In the docker, around midnight, Cheetham heard the boat's back cracking, and all hands scurried to shift their stores. Huddled under the canvas of one of the tents, Greenstreet managed to light a match so that Worsley could glimpse his tiny compass. Later, some of the crew noticed that Worsley himself did not seem to hear them any more, that his head was sinking on his chest. When at last he was persuaded to surrender the helm to Greenstreet, he was so stiff from hunching over the tiller that he could not unbend, and his rigid muscles had to be massaged before he could lie straight on the bottom of the boat. He had not slept for more than 90 hours. It was, wrote Shackleton, a stern night. The James Caird had taken the limping Stanton Wills in tow, though at times the latter was lost to sight, vanishing into the deep trough of the swell, then re-emerging from the Black Sea, tossed on the crest of a wave. The survival of the Wills, the least sound of the boats, depended upon her keeping contact with the Caird, and throughout the night Shackleton sat with his hand on her painter as it grew heavy with ice. He must have been very near exhaustion. Practically ever since we first started, Sir Ernest had been standing erect day and night on the stern counter of the Caird, Lees wrote. How he stood the incessant vigil and exposure is marvellous. Shackleton had not slept since leaving Patience Camp. A sudden heavy squall of snow hid the boats from one another, and when it cleared, the Dudley Docker was gone. She had vanished into the darkness and the racing sea. For Shackleton, this was perhaps the worst moment of the journey. When the dawn came at last, the air was so thick with mist that the men aboard the Caird and the Wills were under the cliffs of Elephant Island before they saw them. Anxiously they followed the precipitous coastline until at 9 a.m. they sighted a narrow beach at the northwest end of the island, beyond a fringe of surf-beaten rocks. I decided we must face the hazards of this unattractive landing place, wrote Shackleton. 2 days and nights without drink or hot food had played havoc with most of the men. His own throat and tongue were so swollen he could only whisper, and his orders were passed along by either Wild or Hurley. Shackleton boarded the Wills to take her through first, and as he did so the Dudley Docker hove in sight. This, wrote Shackleton, took a great load off my mind. The Wills was carefully positioned at an opening in the reef, then shot through on the top of waves to the rough, stony beach beyond. Shackleton gave the word that Blackborrow, as the youngest member of the expedition, should have the honour of being the first to land, but Blackborrow sat motionless. In order to avoid delay, I helped him, perhaps a little too roughly, over the side of the boat, wrote Shackleton. He promptly sat down in the surf and did not move. Then I suddenly realized what I had forgotten, that both his feet were frostbitten badly. The Docker followed the Wills, and then the James Caird, too heavy to land, was unloaded in tedious relays before being taken through the reef and beached beside the other boats. The men staggered onto land. With his vest pocket Kodak camera in hand, Hurley bounded out to record the landing of the boats and the first meal on Elephant Island. Some of the men were reeling about the beach as if they had found an unlimited supply of alcoholic liquor on the desolate island, Shackleton wrote. His bemused, paternal tone conjures an almost comical scene of readjustment, but the diaries hint darkly at the journey's actual toll. Many suffered from temporary aberration, Hurley reported. Walking aimlessly about, others shivering as with palsy. Hudson, McNish states with characteristic directness, has gone off his head. Some filled their pockets with stones, or rolled along the shingled beach, burying their faces in the stones and pouring handfuls over them. In the Wills, only 2 men were fit to do anything, Wordie recorded. Some fellows, moreover, were half crazy. One got an axe and did not stop till he had killed about 10 seals. None of us suffered like this in the Caird. They had spent 7 fearful days in open boats in the South Atlantic, at the beginning of an Antarctic winter. 170 days drifting on a floe of ice with inadequate food and shelter, and not since December 5th, 1914, 497 days before, had they set foot on land. After meals of seal steaks, the men laid their bags on the solid earth and turned in for the night. I did not sleep much, Bakewell recalled. Just lay in my damp sleeping bag and relaxed. It was hard for me to realize that I was on good, solid earth once more. I got up several times during the night and joined the others, who were like me, just too happy to sleep. We would gather around the fire, eat and drink a little, have a smoke, and talk over some of the past adventures. As they would soon discover, they had arrived on an abnormally fine day. Elephant Island offered salvation, but a grimmer or more hostile piece of land was difficult to conceive. The narrow shingle beach, onto which they had drawn the boats, offered little protection from high seas, and the morning after landing, Wild set out with Marston, Crean, Vincent, and McCarthy in the Dudley Docker to scout the coast for a better camp. He returned in the evening after dark, with the news that there was a suitable place 7 miles down the north coast. At daybreak on the 17th, the weary men loaded up the boats, leaving many boxes of sledging rations stacked against the rocks. No one had the energy to load them, and this at least ensured an emergency supply of provisions, in the event a second boat journey was required. Shortly after they shoved off, another gale arose, threatening to sweep the boats out to sea. "Weathered what we call the Castle Rock, and finally reached our destination," wrote Wordie, more exhausted, I think, than by the previous boat journey. The new camp offered a somewhat larger, gravelly beach, but was still foreboding. "Such a wild and inhospitable coast I have never beheld," Hurley wrote upon their arrival, and evoked the vast headland, black and menacing, that arose from a seething surf 1,200 feet above our heads, and so sheer as to have the appearance of overhanging. On the other hand, wildlife was abundant, with seals, gentoo and ringed penguins, and even limpets in the shallow waters, although no sign of the elephant seal from which the island took its name. Many of the men were still incapacitated. The most critical were Blackborough, with severe frostbite, Hudson with frostbite and a mysterious pain in his lower back, and Rickinson, who was believed to have suffered a heart attack. The others on the sick list were simply stove in. After meals of seal steaks and hot milk, the men pitched their flimsy tents as high above the tidal mark of their new camp as possible, and retired to their wet sleeping bags. But a blizzard rose in the night, ripping the largest tent to ribbons and bringing the others down flat. Some of the men crawled into the boats, others simply lay under the collapsed tents with the cold, wet canvas draped across their faces. The wind was severe enough to blow around the beached Dudley Docker, and she is a heavy boat, as Lees noted. Precious gear was lost in this unexpected gale, including aluminum cooking pans and a bag of spare warm underclothing, blown away to parts unknown. On the 19th, with the blizzard still in full spate, the men were awakened by Shackleton, bringing them their breakfast. "The boss is wonderful," wrote Wordie, cheering everyone, and far more active than any other person in camp. At least there was now plenty of food, and the men consumed prodigious amounts of blubber and seal steak. Hurley, Clark, and Greenstreet were enlisted as cooks, Green being one of the men on the sick list. With shelter non-existent, the sleeping bags were now sodden. The heat of the men's bodies melted not just the snow underneath them, but the frozen, reeking guano of the penguin rookery on which they lay. For months the men had dreamt of land, and for long days and nights in the boat they had fought for it. But now the hard truth dawned on them that the conditions they had so far encountered on this particular piece of land did not represent some terrible aberration, or a run of atrocious weather. This was the way it was going to be as long as they were on Elephant Island. On April 19th, a quiet rebellion against these cruel circumstances occurred among the sailors. Some of the men were showing signs of demoralization, Shackleton noted. They had neglected to place their gloves and hats inside their shirts during the night, with the result that these items were frozen solid come morning, demonstrating, as Shackleton stated, the proverbial carelessness of the sailor. They used this negligence as an excuse not to do any work. Only by rather drastic methods were they induced to turn to, wrote Shackleton. What happened here? As at Patience Camp, the diaries leave one with a sense that all the facts have not been plainly spoken. Some of the party had become despondent, wrote Wilde, and were in a what's-the-use sort of mood, and had to be driven to work, none too gently either. Wordie says almost in passing that dejected men were dragged from their bags and set to work. Hurley's pointed diary entry on this day, however, is blistering. Now that the party are established at an immovable base, I review their general behaviour during the memorable escape from the ice. It is regrettable to state that many conducted themselves in a manner unworthy of gentlemen and British sailors. Of a fair proportion of the company, I am convinced they would starve or freeze if left to their own resources on this island, for there is such an improvident disregard for their equipment as to allow it to be buried in snow or be carried off by the winds. Those who shirk duties or lack a fair sense of practicability should not be in these parts. These are harsh places, where it takes all one's time and energies to attend to the individual, and so make himself as effective and useful a unit as possible. It was perhaps no coincidence that Shackleton chose the following day, April 20th, to gather his company to make a momentous announcement. A party of men under his command would shortly set out in the James Caird, and make for the whaling stations of South Georgia. The stupendous difficulties of this journey required no elaboration to the men who had just arrived on Elephant Island. The island of South Georgia was 800 miles away, more than 10 times the distance they had just travelled. To reach it, a 22.5-foot-long open boat would have to cross the most formidable ocean on the planet in the winter. They could expect winds up to 80 miles an hour and heaving waves, the notorious Cape Horn rollers, measuring from trough to crest as much as 60 feet in height. If unlucky, they would encounter worse. They would be navigating towards a small island with no points of land in between, using a sextant and chronometer, under brooding skies that might not permit a single navigational sighting. The task was not merely formidable, it was, as every sailing man in the company knew, impossible. "There is a party of 6 going to Georgia in the Caird," wrote McNish. The party includes Sir Ernest, Skipper, Crean, McNish, McCarthy, Vincent.